This is Hannibal from the HannibalTV.com, and I did an appearance this week on David Penzer's Sitting Ringside podcast that he did let me post in video form on this YouTube channel, and it's also on David Penzer's podcast. It's called Sitting Ringside. It's on iTunes. But he kind of surprised me with a question on that podcast. Of course, he was a former WCW ring announcer as well as a TNA ring announcer. And one of the questions he asked me was about the 2007 TNA Canadian tour, which was the first time TNA ever came to Canada. And I actually brought that tour to Canada. And he surprised me with the question, so I didn't remember all the details. So I had a lot of fans ask me further questions about it, so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on it here. How it started, basically, I had been trying to get in TNA for a while. Terry Taylor was head of talent relations at the time. I had attended a seminar with him, sending tapes back and forth. There was some consideration on bringing me in to have a feud with Abyss at one point. So I had a decent relationship with him. Also, I promoted a Great North Wrestling event in Ottawa in August 2007 that drew almost 4,000 fans. And Jeff Jarrett was on that, Christian, AJ Styles, Johnny Devine. They were all in TNA at the time. But on top of that, we also had Jinder Mahal was on that card, Lanny Poffo, Kamala, Psycho Sid, and Abdullah the Butcher. So it was a star-studded card. Not only did we have the top guys from TNA, but we had top past stars as well as guys like Quebecer Pierre, who were very popular locally and able to help draw that very large crowd that I had in Ottawa. So basically the TNA people were impressed with the crowd that I had there, and I wanted to have a good relationship with TNA, so I got talking to their office people, and they wanted to come to Quebec, which is right on the border of where I live in Ontario, because Quebec had a French TNA TV show on the popular RDS channel that was commentated at the time by Sylvain Grenier. It had been commentated previous to that by Carl Ouellet. So I wanted to do one event in Gatineau, Quebec, which is just across the border from Ottawa, and really focus on it and do a good job promoting on it. But they said they didn't want to come for just one event. It would be too costly for travel to bring everyone for just one event, and there would have to be a minimum of 4 events. So I talked to an arena in Montreal, the Pierre Charbonneau Centre, as well as the Colisée Pepsi in Quebec City, and this building in Oshawa. I think it was called the General Motors Centre at the time, in Oshawa, Ontario, which is just outside of Toronto. They also had interest in going to the Toronto area, but obviously right in Toronto would cost a fortune to rent any of the main arenas. So Oshawa was where we ended up going. As it got closer, the city of Oshawa ended up buying that show from TNA, from what I understand. So basically, I believe the figure was about $40,000 that the city of Oshawa paid TNA to promote the show themselves and then take all the ticket money themselves. With the deal with my events in Quebec was that I would pay for the arenas, and we would split on the advertising costs of the event. And I think the deal was they got 75% of the gate and I got 25% or something along those lines. So the first event of the tour was in Montreal, Quebec. The Montreal one, I think, was the most profitable. We had a good crowd, and the arena was very expensive. I believe it was over $10,000, but it wasn't crazy expensive. So that one went all right. Then there was Quebec City, Quebec. That was the huge loser of the shows. Sometimes there's a bit of a feud between French people and English people in Canada, and also French people. There's a lot of them don't like Americans. And I believe the arena really raked us over the coals for that one. That was probably the biggest arena TNA ever went to. It was a 19,000 seat arena. WWE had been there in the past. And basically we had about 2,000 people in a 19,000 seat arena. Now keep in mind that TNA, they told me they were averaging 800 people per house show at the time. So Montreal had, I believe, over 1,500. Quebec City had around 2,000 people. So we had good crowds, but the arenas were very expensive. I had my numbers wrong for when I was on Penzers. I was saying that the arena cost 70,000. I believe the gate was around 70,000 and the arena was about 45,000. So after tax, we only had about 9,000 left on the gate for that one. So that was terrible. And one of the things that annoyed me about the Quebec City show for TNA was Rick Martel had said he was going to come on to the show and he wanted to do something on the show. And he ended up doing something on the show, but they refused to put him in any of the advertising or do any pre-interviews with him to help publicize that he would be on the show to get a bigger crowd. The same thing happened in Montreal. Sylvain Grenier, who was fresh out of his WWE run where he was 4-time WWE Tag Team Champions in Montreal, he was at the show, and he was also a commentator of the TNA French show, but they wouldn't use him in a match. And on top of that, Quebecer Pierre, who had been the French commentator before Sylvain, 3-time WWE Tag Team Champions, extremely popular in Quebec. They wouldn't use him on the events either. They wanted all TNA guys, which is unfortunate because, as I said, one of the successes of the show that impressed TNA was that I had a mix of guys and some local guys that would draw a crowd. And the same situation happened in Gatineau, where they ended up giving me a match against Abyss on that event, but they only told me literally a couple days before the show that I would be allowed to have a match versus Abyss on that show, which was frustrating because I was a local guy. I could have had huge local press of me wrestling on that show because TNA was at its peak at that time in popularity, but they only told me a few days before. I still ended up getting a couple newspaper articles on it, but it could have been a lot bigger as far as getting local press on the event. So in Gatineau, we drew another large crowd for TNA. It was between 1,500 and 2,000. The Gatineau arena was over 20,000 though, I believe. I think it was $21,000 or $22,000. The gate was over, it was somewhere between 35 and 45,000, I believe. So overall, I don't know if you include the Toronto show, if TNA broke even or not, or had a profit. I personally lost a lot of money on that show, and I ended up having to get a line of credit to pay off my credit cards because I put a lot of the advertising costs on the credit cards. So it was a really bad situation for me, and also it ruined my relationship with TNA because they weren't happy how it turned out. I would have done it differently in retrospect. I hadn't even promoted 10 events at that time. I'd maybe promoted somewhere between 7 and 10 events, probably between 2006 and 2007. At the time, I was given this TNA opportunity, so I was not an experienced promoter. Now I've promoted somewhere probably around 130 to 150 events in the past almost 12 years. So we went to 2 big arenas. That wasn't all my fault. TNA wanted to go to big arenas. They really should have used local stars. I should not have even gotten into that deal because TNA, as popular as it was at the time, they didn't talk about us on the Spike TV show at all. They didn't talk about these events ever on the Spike TV show. And TNA in itself wasn't popular enough to fill any of those arenas. They needed supplementary stars, and I'm not saying bring in Psycho Sid and all these guys, but some local stars such as Sylvain Grenier, Quebecer Pierre, that could have got more local buzz on the show. And they were a pain to deal with to get interviews for their guys as well on the media the free media interviews that I did get them. So overall, it was very disappointing. I learned a lot, and I would definitely do it differently if I ever did it again, but I would never do it again. I did wrestle for Impact Wrestling one more time when they returned to the Ottawa area in November 2017. I think they just used me on that event to help get some local publicity for the show, which I did. Got numerous newspaper articles, television and radio news stories. We had the largest crowd of the 6 shows other than the Bound for Glory show on the night that I wrestled, where Abyss was coincidentally my agent for the match, which aired on Explosion. I had good feedback on the match from Abyss and the producers, but never heard back from Impact Wrestling after that. So that's my story on TNA and Impact Wrestling for all the fans that wanted to know.